Welcome to Savills Shares, the podcast, where we spill the tea on all things real estate. I'm Jacke Chye, your host, and today we have Paul Tostevin, Head of World Research, joining us from London. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Hi, Jack.
Yeah, Paul, you've been doing research with Savills for the last 16 years. So what is it exactly about research that drives you?
Real estate research is an interesting job because it's all about places. It's about buildings that we live, work and play in. My academic background is actually in geography, so I've always had an interest in the world, places, how they're shaped, and it's really a natural progression of that. And within Savills World Research specifically, I look at the big trends shaping global real estate. So that's really varied. It ranges from the impact of technology, how that's shaping buildings and cities, through to demographic trends in certain parts of the world and for certain asset classes, through to the very big challenge we're facing around climate change and how buildings to respond and adapt to that. So I'm fortunate to have such a varied role and be doing it for a big global dynamic organization like Savills.
Now, the Savills Tech Cities represented and reported a movement of people from large to smaller cities recently. Now, does that have an impact on the housing on the largest cities becoming more affordable while the cost of living as well as housing in the smaller cities go up?
It's a good question to start this discussion, actually, because it captures some of the broader trends. So the Tech Cities program looks at the drivers of the tech industry specifically and how that's shaping different cities and their real estate markets. But one of the big trends we've seen in that industry in the last decade is the global diversification of the tech industry. So tech is everywhere. It isn't just limited to those traditional hubs like San Francisco, although of course they remain important. So what we've seen is a flow of people from those traditional hubs like San Francisco through to what have been sort of smaller, sometimes cheaper cities. So in the US, you're seeing that going from the places like Austin, Denver, Raleigh, Durham, a few examples. And one of the effects of that is it has caused to some extent in the very intense hubs like San Francisco to see costs fall, because that's a very tech heavy market, but not enough to make it affordable at scale. In the very big sort of world cities like New York and London, any outflow has really been too small to set any net inflows to really move prices. I think what you see though is a greater impact on those once smaller, more affordable cities. So Austin's a good case in point. Seeing lots of new investment, flows of people attracted by jobs, lower taxes in that case as well. And that's a pressure they've had to deal with. So those lower housing costs have risen as new stock hasn't been able to keep up with demand.
Right, lots of food for thought there. Now, countries like the Netherlands and Sweden see a lot of rental regulation. How exactly does rental regulation help?
Yeah, EU nations tend to have, well, first of all, they have larger proportions of rental housing to begin with, and the sector, or at least parts of their rental sector, is often regulated. So in the Netherlands, a large share of rental stock is regulated. The majority of that stock is owned by housing associations. In Sweden, rental apartments are very strongly regulated by law. Actually, all landlords negotiate rent annually with the Swedish Union of Tenants. Spain is another example. There's a rental cap in place on annual rental increases in certain circumstances. Now, the impact of that, I mean, for one, it gives more certainty to tenants. It avoids big rental increases. It can give them more security. In Sweden, because of that, association has very strong, tenants have much stronger rights. Generally, though, it varies by country, and it's good if you're in the system, but it can be difficult if you don't meet the criteria, and then you are at the whim of the open market or part of the market that isn't so controlled. One interesting standout, though, is Vienna at the European level. It has a very large share of its population that live in subsidized or city-owned apartments, and there's actually a relatively high cap on income as well, which means that it's one of the very few markets where a large share of the population don't face the same affordability challenges, but even then there is a proportion who do. So you've got to live in the city for 2 years to qualify, for example, before you add to that system.
I see. Now, sometimes regulation can be seen as a barrier to the supply of new rental homes because it just doesn't drive enough revenue for investors. How true is that?
Yeah, so regulations are often seen as a barrier to the supply of new rental homes. It's not necessarily the case. I think institutional investors need regulatory certainty, I think is more the case, certainly to underwrite investments. And actually, the biggest challenge for investors is uncertainty around regulations. What they don't want to see is those keeping on changing, because they'll wait until there is certainty. And regulators also need to be mindful that investors have to make a return in order to deliver and manage new housing. I think, though, the caveat to all this discussion around regulation, it really sort of tinkers around the edges. And our analysis, in my team has shown that the real opportunity is in the delivery of new supply. So bear in mind, in the developed world, prices have risen by 70% since 2013, but incomes are just up 23% over the same period. So it's a real mismatch in terms of income growth versus price growth. And of course, layer on top of that, rising interest rates in many global markets. We've really seen a shortage of new supply that's exacerbating this sort of supply-demand dynamic.
Right. Well, on that note itself, in Asia, how are the supply and demand dynamics and housing affordability playing out across this region?
There's real variation in countries across Asia, I think, and that said, some of the challenges are common. China's a really interesting one. It's built a lot of new homes in the last decade, whereas actually population growth in many cases has come to a standstill. What you've got to remember there is urbanization continues, particularly with the flow of workers from provincial areas to the first-tier cities like Shanghai and Beijing. So affordability is not so much a China-wide issue, but more of a first and second-tier city issue. I think with a lot of globally competitive cities, more companies congregate around those smaller top-tier cities, and that's where you see jobs and attracting talented workforces. That puts pressure on housing markets. The other factor that's worth flagging around China is that there's a preferred incentive or willingness to invest in residential property to store wealth. Holding costs are low. A lot of investors will leave those properties empty, which actually makes the problem worse as well. But China is looking to solve these problems, encouraging the development of rental housing, for example. But yeah, a sort of quite a nuanced situation there. Japan, probably the other one to talk about, similar in so much as the problem is more acute in certain areas of Japan. So while the overall population is declining, large dynamic cities like Tokyo, Osaka still growing. And also while the national level supply is fairly high, it isn't enough still in those big growing cities, and the overall situation is actually more complicated because Japan's housing stock is continually demolished and rebuilt, meaning that many new homes actually don't add to the overall volume. So I think, like a lot of this, it's you can draw some sort of regional comparisons, but residential property is very localized, very local conditions shaping what's happening.
So in that sense, what sort of other challenges or maybe even opportunities are there around the whole issue of housing affordability then?
Government, I think, has a really important role to play here. And I think that's a key kind of push factor in all this. But we know that national balance sheets are already pretty squeezed. The other factor is the kind of broader economic and financial backdrop. So financing costs are a big headwind. Of course, higher interest rates, that means higher borrowing costs for developing, whether that's open market or social or public housing. The industry as a whole has to deal with rising inflation in construction, whether that's labour costs or construction costs, build costs. I think the key with those points is working together. The private sector can bring that capital and expertise, while the public sector has access to land and help develop that sort of transparent business environment. I guess looking more positively, there's a couple of potentials here. So that piece around getting more large-scale institutional investment into housing of all types is really important. And that means making sure that housing can provide a sustainable return, particularly affordable rental housing. We know there's a lot of capital waiting in the wings to invest in living. It's just got to stack up. Another really interesting factor, the drive to net zero. Governments have really ambitious climate targets. Residential property is the largest real estate sector. There's a lot of potential to drive down carbon emissions from that sector. Again, getting those big investors into that sector gives that scale to tackle this at a big level. And the last point, I suppose, is around what our cities and neighbourhoods look like. So where appropriate, can they be densified? Are there regeneration opportunities, getting more homes into a tighter footprint, but also improving those places at the same time, amenities, shared space. It's something that's a big drive in the US in particular, where you've got a lot of lower density suburbs that surround a lot of US cities, and we've seen a few examples where that has been done successfully.
Right. Well, I mean, taking things on a more local level, in Singapore itself, every young couple dreams of owning their own private residence. Yet Singapore is probably one of the most regulated real estate market, especially when it comes to the purchase of private residence. Now, on a global level, what sort of impact do you think that regulations and cooling measures have on prices and supply?
Singapore's one of, it's not unique when it comes to regulations, but it is one of the more regulated markets. So last year, doubling the additional buyer stamp duty for overseas buyers, also those additional duties for domestic buyers of second properties, and that makes certainly Singaporeans important outbound buyers as well globally. Generally, these measures can include stamp duties to holding costs to restrictions on certain buyer groups. Hong Kong's an interesting one to look at because there's some parallels to Singapore. It used to have very high transactional costs, particularly for overseas or non-local buyers. It's actually recently stripped those right back, taking it from being one of the most expensive global markets in which to transact to one of the cheapest. And that was an aim to really help stimulate that market, which has cooled significantly in the last couple of years. I think, though, generally what you tend to see with these cooling measures is they'll have an impact on the short term. They'll hit transactions, but the market does adjust. And ultimately, the only way to really control higher costs or tackle affordability is to deliver more supply. Comes back to that basic supply and demand dynamic. And there are other approaches. So we talked a little bit earlier about rental regulations. In the sales market, the US has quite high holding costs. So property taxes are very high in the US. That perhaps makes people think twice about investment properties, but it's certainly something very strong there still. Other factors, again, for rental properties, a lot of markets will have a requirement for them to be registered to ensure they maintain certain standards. All sorts of different factors that can work for different parts of the market. But I think, like I say, the real solution is in supply.
Supply is the magic bullet.
It's probably the closest we get to one. Our research has told us there isn't a magic bullet, if only because housing is very localized. You've got to consider local market conditions, economies, drivers, cultural preferences as well, government. But I think anything that can unlock supply, I guess supply is a magic bullet, but the challenge is getting that supply, which means, those public-private partnerships, boosting land supply, investment in construction jobs. That's really an aging industry in many countries. Looking at things like modern methods of construction, different types of housing, so student housing, senior housing, that frees up the market more broadly. It's important because every year that a nation or market is undersupplied, that affordability problem is only compounded. So the sooner this is addressed, the better.
Well, how will the dynamics of global housing demand and supply evolve and impact both the purchase as well as rental prices over the next decade?
Lots to look out for over the next decade. So again, thinking about that economic backdrop, we've just come out of that period of quite high inflation. I think that's now behind us. That gives some hope that we'll start to see rate cuts in certain markets around the world. But I think that era of ultra low interest rates is behind us. So we will be looking at higher cost mortgages, higher cost of finance. It also means that we're going to be in a comparatively weaker period of global economic growth, and that's a challenging backdrop for any industry. Also, housing markets. It's also higher mortgage costs at a more targeted level will continue to push more people to rent, and that's a market that's already quite squeezed in terms of shortage of stock. I suppose looking ahead the next sort of 5-10 years. The governments globally this is at the top of many of their agendas. I think it has to be because there is major concern among voters. That's only going to put more government focus on addressing the issue. So perhaps more support to get houses built, more support maybe for first-time buyers or other incentives. And as I said a few times, I think the big opportunity of the next decade is more in institutional investment into rental housing. So it's already a very big sector in the US, for example, growing in Europe and other parts of the world. And I think there is potentially some good rewards for investors who are willing to take on the risks and deliver that much needed housing, but also provide some stable returns for investors too.
Right. Okay, so maybe on a more personal level, I could ask you, Paul, apart from housing affordability, what other factors would you take into consideration before deciding on where you will be residing?
Yeah, a couple of factors come into play. So what do people think about when they need to move somewhere? I mean, economic opportunity, that's clearly the big one. And going back to the first point we talked about, which is that flow of people from big cities to the smaller ones or the tech sector. People are moving for jobs or study, looking at the strength of the employment market, higher education, that's a big driver. I think quality of life has become really important in the last couple of years. It's always mattered, of course, but particularly post-pandemic, people are really putting emphasis on pollution, climate, amenities, leisure, open space. So, what does your neighborhood look like? What does your city look like? Of course, things like family connections will drive many people to move to certain places. But I think actually the big one, I think in the next couple of years, increasingly will be climate. I think people already look for certain, mild climates, but I think increasingly with climate change, people will be driven to more stable climates as well. Particularly as we see the effects of climate change become more severe.
Yes, climate is extremely important for a country like Singapore. But then again, for me, no winter, please. Thank you for spending your time with us, Paul. You can read all about Paul's article on housing affordability in the provided link in our caption. And you can catch a fresh new episode of Savills Share the Podcast every month on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Till our next episode, blessed day ahead. This podcast is for general information only and should not be taken as professional advice. Savills accept no responsibility or liability for any direct or indirect or any consequential loss from the use of, reference to, or the reliance on this podcast or its content.